In an effort to correct what critics have called modern slavery, the country's new anti-forced labor legislation, which is now a law, aims to root out and penalize suppliers found guilty of abuses. So experts say Canada imported nearly $48 billion worth of risky imports from suppliers in 2021. And while new rules represent a step forward, some fear this law does not go far enough to solve the problem. Joining us this morning is Benali Chowdhury, professor of law at York University and director of the Jack and May Nathanson Center on Transnational Human Rights, Crime and Security. Welcome to your morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
So the new rules require large Canadian companies to report on their efforts to prevent child labor and forced labor within their supply chains. If they don't abide, they could be facing fines of up to $250,000. Two questions for you here. Is there enough enforcement, policing of these new laws? And do they go far enough?
Yeah, so it's relatively early in the morning, so I'm going to be charitable. And I'm going to say that these laws are a good start, right? Forced labor, child labor, those are very important impacts that corporations often have on these kinds of issues. And reporting obligations is a great first step in this direction. But the law really fails in two ways. And the first thing is that, as you mentioned, in terms of enforcement, there's only enforcement for reporting on these kinds of obligations. There's no accountability if the corporation actually engages in forced labor or child labor, at least under this piece of legislation. And the second big shortcut,
No, go ahead.
And the second big shortcoming really is that in 2023, we now recognize that there is a whole range of impacts that corporations can have far beyond just forced labor and child labor. And this law just really doesn't go far enough.
You know, when people are trying to imagine companies that could be involved in this, a lot of times clothing companies, for example, come to mind. But what other industries are we looking at that could be facing penalties?
I mean, the biggest industry in Canada are mining companies, and that's really where we see the biggest impacts on human rights and environmental issues.
What are some of the types of concerns about the supply chains for Canadian companies? What are the ones that you're most focused on?
I mean, unfortunately, there's a full laundry list of things that these corporations are engaging in. So we have everything from, discrimination towards women in employment practices and failing to let workers unionize in these kinds of industries. And then we have things like murder, assault, rape, slavery, torture, and widespread environmental degradation.
You know, we are not the first country to put legislation in place surrounding this. What strategies have other countries taken trying to crack down on human rights violations that they know to be in their supply chains?
Yeah, so there's a wide range of countries that are now involved in implementing these kinds of pieces of legislation. Everyone from Norway to Japan is involved in some aspect of this. But for our purposes, for Canadian purposes, the things that we most care about are the new laws that are going to be coming into place from the European Union. And that's because these laws are going to apply to Canadian companies that have a certain amount of turnover within the European Union or that are subsidiaries of European Union countries. So Canadian companies are going to be required to engage in due diligence, even though our laws don't necessarily require them to do so.
So then what more do you think Canada should be doing to ensure accountability for companies that are known to make use of abusive suppliers?
Yeah, so, I mean, we really need to have two things. And the first is we need to have our own Canadian due diligence laws that are really designed to address Canadian interests and Canadian values. So we want Canadian companies to identify, prevent, and mitigate their impacts on human rights and environmental issues. And we also want some degree of accountability. So if Canadian companies do engage in these kinds of bad practices, we want them to be held accountable. And the only way to do that is to have our own due diligence laws that will actually require some accountability for Canadian companies engaged in these kinds of bad acts.
So first step, but a long way to go, it sounds like. Benali Chowdhury, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this, be sure to subscribe here, or you can check out more Your Morning videos right here.